I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we continue with section 914 of The Incarnation of Ahriman by Rudolph Steiner. Essay 6, Stuttgart, the 20th of December, 1919. When I have had occasion in recent years to speak about any of the great festivals of the year, Christmas, Easter, or Whitsun, I have felt bound to say that we have no right on such occasions to commemorate these festivals in the old accustomed manner. We have no right to forget the widespread suffering, the widespread sorrow of our times, and to recall only the greatest, most incisive event in earthly evolution. Standing as we do on the foundations of a spiritual view of the world, it is our duty to allow all symptoms of decline in human civilization today to permeate our thoughts and penetrate right through to the Christmas tree. It is a particular duty to receive the birth of Christ Jesus into our hearts, into our souls, in such a way that we do not close our eyes to the fearful deterioration that has overtaken the so-called civilized world. On this day particularly, we need to ask whether the whole idea of Christmas has also succumbed to the forces of general decline. When Christmas is spoken of today, do we still sense what we should sense when we raise our thoughts and feelings to contemplate the festival of Christ? Are people in general conscious of the true meaning of what entered human evolution at the mystery of Golgotha? We light up our Christmas trees, we repeat the customary words and phrases associated with the Christmas festival, but all too often we avoid opening our eyes fully. We avoid awakening fully to the need to acknowledge that here too there is decline. We avoid asking, "Where are you, O Christ power?" to actively bring about a new ascent. It must be clear to you from the lectures given in our circles over many years that only the power of Christ is capable of permeating declining civilization with an impulse which can regenerate it anew. At this time of year one, can often recall people in the middle of the 19th century, or towards the last third of it, who out of certain materialistic mentalities spoke quite differently from the way many people speak today. In fact, they spoke more honestly than most people do nowadays. I would like to remind you of one individual, a truly materialistic mind, David Friedrich Strauss. You may know that this book, The Old Faith and the New, is a kind of Bible of materialism. One of the questions Strauss asks in his book is whether we can still be Christians. He answers this question, and the unusual thing about his answer is that it comes from a fundamentally materialistic, but at the same time honest mind. David Friedrich Strauss constructed a universal edifice of thoughts and ideas formed entirely according to physical materialistic laws. He placed the human being within it in a world order in which human nature is governed solely by physical laws. Based on these convictions, Strauss answered the question, can we still be Christians, with an emphatic and honest no. People who hold contemporary views of natural science, such as Strauss, cannot be Christians. Thus, a dire but entirely honest opinion is expressed this no of David Friedrich Strauss, and today we often wish that the official advocates of this or that religious faith were as honest as David Friedrich Strauss. If only they could see that though they use the name of Christ, they are really active opponents of Christianity. My dear friends, we should not surrender ourselves to a love of ease, nor close our eyes to vitally important contemporary phenomena. It may not seem to you to be associated with Christmas, though it does indeed seem to be so to me, when I refer to an experience which came to me through a kind of spiritual investigation of an immediate contemporary phenomenon. After misfortune broke over Europe, what did those people do who to a great extent are responsible, especially in Central Europe, insofar as any human being can be held responsible for these things, for the dreadful conditions into which we have drifted? What did these people do when misfortune broke over Europe? They wrote books. Books were written by all kinds of people. Now, the following experiment can be done with the help of spiritual science. We can ask what forms and gestures of thought speak to us from the greater part of these self-vindicating books. I have tried to approach this question from all angles. I asked myself what kind of thought forms have arisen from these people on whom so much of the fate of Central Europe depends. if we do not proceed in a merely abstract way, but enter into things in specific details, it's necessary to compare one thing with another. Thus, a comparison suggested itself to me when I asked myself at what period in Europe's historical evolution were such thought forms cultivated as those surfacing in leading personalities during the Great War. After conscientious scrutiny of the facts, it became clear to me that many people naturally thought in this manner about the time of the Roman Julius Caesar. There's no difference between the soul and thought life of Julius Caesar at the time, let us say, of his Gallic Wars, and the way in which such modern individuals formed their thoughts. This means that these people have remained at a stage and in a life of thought entirely unaffected by Christianity, for Caesar lived before the mystery of Golgotha had broken into evolution. Even if the name of Christ Jesus is sometimes on their lips, the soul life of these people has developed in a way that has nothing to do with actual Christianity. Our many and diverse studies have shown that if anything develops in its own period, it is fundamentally good for humanity, but that the opposite is true if it remains stationary and surfaces later. When this happens, when, for instance, something that was suited to the time of the Caesars continues to play a part in the 20th century, what was appropriate in Caesar's day is transformed into something Luciferic. Something that rightly belongs to another period becomes, if it remains stationary, Luciferic. In fact, that is the precise nature of the Luciferic influence. This in turn leads to the question of why people whose fate had placed them in a leading position remain behind in this way to their lives. To answer this question, we must turn our attention to those who claim to imbue the spiritual life with the Christ impulse, but who really work in an anti-Christian way. Let us turn our attention to the many official representatives of religious creeds, people who pretend to speak according to the Gospels, but who are opposed to everything that really tells of the living Christ in our time. The most anti-Christian people are frequently found today among the clergy, among the preachers of so-called Christian creeds. An answer to this question can be found by examining a book, regarded by many as highly relevant, entitled The Nature of Christianity by Adolph Harnack. If the name of Christ were struck out of this book and replaced by the name of a God generally little known, a God who permeates and controls human life just as he permeates and controls nature, if the name of Christ were struck out and replaced by the name of Jehovah or Yahweh of the Old Testament, this book would be nearer the truth than it is, and would then have some meaning. The fact is that Adolph Harnack knows nothing of the real nature of Christ, does not have the vaguest idea of the real Christ being, but worships a universal indefinite God and then ascribes the name of Christ to this universal indefinite God. And who is Adolph Harnack? Adolph Harnack has become a fashionable theologian in circles which shore up the spiritual tendencies of those individuals I have been speaking of. Since no true revelation regarding the Christ any longer comes from representatives of the creeds, we no longer find any true sense of the manifestation of Christ in contemporary events and people connected with them. It hardly means anything to thousands to millions of people of the present day when they speak of the festival of Christmas, for they know nothing of the reality of Christ in the sense that is so necessary for our time. We must examine these things if we wish to gain a deeper understanding of the causes of degeneration and decline apparent in contemporary events and in human life connected with these events. I have frequently spoken to you here of that important event which came to pass in the last third of the 19th century, the event through which a special relationship was established between the archangel being whom we call Michael and the destiny of mankind. Since November 1879, Michael has become the regent, as it were, of all those who seek to endow human beings with the beneficial forces necessary to their healthy progress. Referring to such a thing involves two different aspects. Firstly, the objective fact, and second, the way this objective fact is connected with what human beings are willing to receive into their consciousness, into their will. The objective fact is simply this, that in November 1879, beyond the sphere of the sense world, in the supersensible world, an event took place which may be described as follows. Michael acquired the capacity, so long as people come to meet him with all the living content of their souls, to endow and permeate them with his power, thus enabling them to transform their old materialistic power of reason, which by then had become a dominant force in humanity, into spiritual intellectual power, into spiritual power of understanding. That is objective fact. It has taken place. We may say that since November 1879, Michael has entered into a different relationship with the human being than the one he formerly had. But at the same time, we need to serve Michael. The following explanation will quite clearly be made to you in what I mean by this. You'll recall that before the mystery of Golgotha took place on earth, the Jews of the Old Testament looked up to their Yahweh. Those who, among the Jewish priests, looked up in full consciousness to Yahweh were well aware that they could not reach him directly with human perception. The very name Yahweh was held to be unspeakable, and if it had to be uttered in a sign only was made, one which resembles certain combinations of signs which we attempt in the art of eurythmy. The Jewish priesthood, however, was well aware that human beings could approach Yahweh through Michael. They called Michael the countenance of Yahweh. Just as we learn to know someone when we look into his face, just as we draw conclusions about the gentleness of his soul from the gentleness of his countenance, and about his character from the way he looks at us, so the priesthood of Old Testament times, through the atavistic clairvoyance which flowed into their souls in dreams, desired to gain from the countenance of Yahweh, from Michael's connection with Yahweh, something that it was not yet possible for mankind as a whole to gain. The stance of these priests towards Michael and Yahweh was the right one. Their approach towards Michael was right because they knew that if someone of that time turned to Michael, he could find through Michael the Yahweh power, which was proper for humanity of that time to seek. Since then, other soul regents of humanity have appeared in the place of Michael, but in November 1879, Michael once more assumed this regency, and can become active in the soul life of those who seek paths to him. These paths today are those of spiritual scientific knowledge. We may call them the paths of Michael just as well as the paths of spiritual scientific knowledge. But from the very same time when Michael entered in this way into relationship with human souls, to become their inspirer for 3 centuries, the demonic counterforce, which had been preparing for this, set up the very strongest opposition to him. Thus a cry went through the world during our so-called war years, in reality years of terror, a cry which has become a universal misunderstanding now filling human hearts and souls. Let us consider what would have become of the Jewish people of the Old Testament if instead of approaching Yahweh through Michael, they had sought to approach him directly. They would have become an intolerant people, an egotistic people concerned with the aggrandizement of their own nation, a nation thinking only of itself. For Yahweh is the God connected with all natural things. In the outward historical development of mankind, he manifests in the sequences of generations, as this expresses itself in the essential qualities of the people. It was only because the ancient Jewish people at that time desired to approach Yahweh through Michael that they saved themselves from becoming such an egotistic race that Christ Jesus would not have been able to come forth into their midst. Through permeating themselves with the Michael power, in the form this power took at that time, the Jewish people were less strongly impregnated with national egotism than they would have been if they had turned directly to Yahweh. Today Michael is again the regent of the world, but mankind must now relate to him in a new way. Michael is now no longer the countenance of Yahweh, but the countenance of Christ Jesus. Today we must approach the Christ impulse through Michael. In many respects, humanity has not yet worked its way through this stage. Humanity has atavistically retained the old qualities of perception by which Michael could be approached when he was still the intermediary to Yahweh. Thus, mankind today has the wrong relationship to Michael. This misguided relationship to Michael is apparent in a very characteristic phenomenon. During the war years, the following universal lie was continually heard: freedom and self-determination for individual nations, even for the smallest countries. This is an essentially false idea, because today in the Michael age, human individuals are the important thing, rather than groups and nations. This lie is nothing other than the endeavor to permeate each individual nation, not with the new but the old forces of Michael from pre-Christian times, with the Michael power of the Old Testament. However paradoxical it may sound, there is a tendency among so-called civilized nations today to transform what was justifiable among the Jewish people of the Old Testament into something Luciferic, and to make this the most powerful impulse in every single nation. Nowadays, people wish to found the dominions of Poland, France, America, etc. upon methods of thought suited to Old Testament times. They strive to follow Michael as it was right to follow him before the mystery of Golgotha, when humanity endeavored to reach the nation God Yahweh through him. Today is Christ Jesus whom we must strive to find through Michael, Christ Jesus, the divine leader of the whole human race. This means we must seek for feelings and ideas which have nothing to do with human distinctions and differences of any kind on earth. Such feelings and ideas cannot be found on the surface. They must be sought where the human spirit and soul pulsate. That is the path of spiritual science. We must resolve to seek the real Christ by practicing spiritual science, in other words, upon the Michael path. Only through the striving for spiritual truth is the real Christ to be sought and found. Otherwise, it would be better to extinguish the lights of Christmas, to destroy all Christmas trees, and to acknowledge the truth fully, at least, that we want nothing that will recall what Christ Jesus brought to human evolution. Editor's note. Yes. Moving on. Pre-Christian ways of thinking speak to us from the memoirs of our contemporaries, ways of thinking which in our times are anti-Christian. When supposedly representative people make pronouncements such as Wilson did in his 14 points, nothing but pure Old Testament mentality resounds from such pronouncements, a mentality which in our time has become Luciferic. What is the reason for this? What is really at work here? When we travel back through the periods of human evolution prior to the mystery of Golgotha, we find, early in the course of Oriental civilization, within the civilization which gave rise to modern Chinese civilization, a human personality who is the outward embodiment and incarnation of Lucifer. Lucifer really did walk the earth at that time in a human body. It was he who bore that Christian light. It was he who bore that human light, which we find underlying ancient pre-Christian wisdom, with the exception of Judaism. In the art, the philosophy, and the statesmanship of Greece, much was still active which had proceeded from this incarnation of Lucifer, thousands of years before the mystery of Golgotha. It's important to try to understand that what we nowadays call human reason is always, so long as we have not spiritualized it, a gift of Lucifer. We should not hold the Philistine and sectarian view that anything Luciferic is dreadful, which we need to rid ourselves of. The more we seek to get rid of Lucifer, the more we will be dominated by him. For it was necessary during thousands of years of human evolution to enter into the inheritance of the incarnated Lucifer. Then came the mystery of Golgotha. And a time will come in the future when, just as Lucifer was incarnated in the East in an earthly personality to prepare for Christianity among pagan peoples, so in the West an earthly incarnation of Ahriman himself will take place. This time is approaching. Ahriman will appear in a real objective sense on the earth, just as Lucifer walked the earth and as Christ walked the earth, objectively in human form. So Ahriman too will walk the earth, bringing with him an extraordinary increase of power to earthly human reason. It is not our task as human beings to hinder in any way this incarnation of Ahriman, but it is our task to prepare humanity in advance so that Ahriman can be weighed up in the right way. For Ahriman will have various tasks, and human beings must value rightly and make a right use of what enters the world through Ahriman. Humanity will only be able to do this if it is able to adjust in the right way now to what Ahriman is already sending to the earth from supersensible worlds in order to control financial affairs upon earth without being noticed. This must not happen. Ahriman must not control financial affairs and economics on the earth without being noticed. We must thoroughly familiarize ourselves with his particular qualities and recognize what he does. We must be able to oppose him with full consciousness. In my lectures here in Stuttgart, I will refer to things we must carefully note in human evolution up to the time of the Ahriman incarnation, so that when this happens we can know how to assess it in the right way. Today I will only call your attention to one thing more, in respect of which many modern interpretations of the Gospels are just as bad as the worst materialistic views. When representatives of so-called religious societies accept the Gospels today simply as they are written, and when every new revelation is rejected, such devotion to the Gospels, such a way of furthering Christianity, is really the best way to prepare for Ahriman's appearance on earth. A great many of the exponents of today's sects or so-called creeds are working intensively for Ahriman. They ignore the truth, I am with you always, even into the end of the earthly ages, and declare heretical all that proceeds from direct vision of the Christ today. They ignore this truth because it is more comfortable to interpret the Gospels in a merely literal way. That is, to hold what they consider to be the literal interpretation of the Gospels. Mankind needs to be protected by wisdom from regarding the Gospels in this way, for in an outward sense alone, for our physical power of reason, the four Gospels do contradict one another. Those who do not delve further and seek a spiritual interpretation of the Gospels, in fact disseminate an untruthful interpretation of them, deceiving people about the outward contradictions which are to be found there. And those who deceive human beings about the things that concern them most vitally best further Ahriman's progress. It is most important for contemporary humanity to place Christ in the center between Ahriman and Lucifer. The Christ power must permeate us, but as human beings we must always seek the balance between mystic raptures which elevate us beyond ourselves and materialistic reasoning which drags us down to earth. At every moment we must seek the balance between Luciferic impulses which lift us up and Ahrimanic ones which drag us down. In the effort to seek this balance we find the Christ. Only when we seek this balance can we find the Christ. By strange providence, a remarkable thing happened in human evolution at the time materialism began to take hold. In relation to this, I will mention two texts, Milton's Paradise Lost and Klopstock's Messiah. In these poems, the spiritual worlds are described as if a paradise had been lost and man had been driven out of it. The work of both poets is based on the idea of duality in the universe, on the opposition of good and evil, of the divine and the diabolical. It is the great error of modern times that world evolution should be represented as a duality, whereas it should be represented as a trinity. One set of forces are the upward striving Luciferic forces which approach us through mysticism, sentimentality, and rapturous imagination. But also in all that degenerates into fantasy and phantasm, forces which dwell in our blood. The second are the Ahrimanic forces, which dwell in all that is dry, heavy, speaking physiologically, in the skeletal system. The Christ stands in the middle between these two. His is the third group of forces. Lucifer's is the first, Ahriman's the second, and in the center between the two is the Christ force. What has occurred in our modern era? Something has occurred which we should regard with true spiritual and intellectual awe. For unless we understand what it is that has happened, we cannot enter in the right way into the Christmas festival. We read Milton and Klopstock today. We read their descriptions of the supersensible world. What do we find? Everywhere we find Luciferic qualities ascribed to beings who are called divine. Writers such as Milton and Klopstock describe the fight between Luciferic qualities which appear to them divine and Ahrimanic qualities. And a great part of what modern humanity describes as divine is simply Luciferic. People do not recognize it for what it is, just as little as they recognize the true nature of the Ahrimanic forces. The same thing surfaces in Goethe's Faust, where we find Mephistopheles contrasted with quote-unquote the Lord. Goethe, too, was unable to distinguish between the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic. Consequently, his Mephistopheles is a kind of mixture of the two. I've already pointed this out in my booklet Goethe's Goethestart. True followers of Goethe do not merely quote literally from his works, as do many academics. If we faithfully travel the path that Goethe took, so that we recognize where he needed to develop and change, especially if we examine his view of the world after 1832, we can then speak of a Goethe of 1919 and shortly to 1920. We must find a way to admit, with equanimity, that in materialistic centuries much that is Luciferic in nature is hidden behind what is called divine. There's much in what people nowadays seek to spread as religion that reaches humanity only as words born on the wings of Lucifer. Only when people are once more able to recognize this dualism, the Luciferic that leads them above and beyond themselves, and the Ahrimanic that leads them beneath themselves, and in turn from these to what is truly Christ-like, only then will they again celebrate the Christmas event in the right way, as an event which enables us to recall how Earth acquired its own true and particular meaning from that entered into human evolution. Today we cannot help thinking sometimes of Leonardo da Vinci, who once, as you know, painted his great picture The Last Supper in Milan, Christ with his disciples around him. Leonardo took a long time painting this picture, 20 years. He wanted to put a great deal into it and could never finish it because he was always making fresh attempts to paint the figure of Judas in the right way. Now in the state of Milan, the abbot of the monastery for which the picture was being painted was Leonardo's immediate employer. When a new abbot arrived, a sharp, resolute man, not so patient as his predecessor, he went to Leonardo and told him sternly that the picture must be swiftly finished. Leonardo replied that he could now finish the picture, for since the new abbot had arrived, he had a model for Judas. In a short time, he had painted the face of Judas as we now see it in the picture. Just as the beginning of our modern era, the face of Judas appeared to Leonardo, as it were, against the background of a positive faith, so nowadays we have frequent occasion to inscribe in our hearts and souls the fact that he whose birth we commemorate at this holy season is betrayed most of all by many of those who declare that celebrating this festival is dictated by their faith. We know that the Christmas festival itself has been adopted in the course of Christian history, that it was not until the 3rd or 4th century that people began to commemorate the birth of Christ during the days of December. The event of Golgotha took place some centuries before the institution of Christmas. This was something incisively new at that time, adopted by those whose thoughts focused on that event. Much, much later, it was still possible for new things to be implanted in Christianity. Many of those who called themselves true Christians fought at the time against such innovations. Today, there are a great many of such people at work who will not advance in the way their own creed advanced when it accepted the institution of Christmas in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Such people hold rigidly to literal interpretations and turn away from every living revelation. Terrible as is the depth of somnolence among people at the present day, who, with their immoral ways of thought, too often cast a slur on things seeking to enter the spiritual life. The worst of all are those who betray the true spirit of Christian development springing from its very core. It is this earnest mood that the lights of Christmas tree have engendered in us today. Next time I hope to speak of them in another connection. Thus concludes section 914 of the Incarnation of Ahriman. Next time, we will finish the book with Essay 7, Stuttgart, 28th of December 1919, which will be section 915. I will see you then. Alam.